of the terminology and the fact that you can string together a whole bunch of these things, and that is a way to navigate through this system. We always use the dots this way, but usually we had to say get something and get the next thing. But here with public data, it's just next dot next dot next and data and whatever, right? There's no get methods in the way here. Okay. All right. Any questions about that? Okay. So let's talk about then, let's talk about how we're going to traverse, right? So let's see if we can go, let's just talk about the fact that we're going to need to march through this list very often, right? We're going to need to march through this list. So one of the typical things that we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to start at the beginning, because you always have to start on front, and then you need to navigate until something happens. Maybe you need to navigate until you get to the end. Maybe you need to navigate until you find something. But one way or another, you're going to have to start and march, right? You're going to be marching along as you go here. So how do we do that? What's this idea of marching along? And here's the idea. We want to set up a separate little reference, right, that can do that marching for us. Very typically, we'll see it called current. Doesn't have to be, that's not a magic name. But very often, you're going to make a reference called current. And you're going to point it at the first node because that's your starting point, right? And then you're going to need to march along, and you want to move current from place to place so that you can see if the data you're looking for is in fact there, right? So the question is, what is the code that makes this thing march along? If I have a reference called current, how do I march such that current, after the statement that I write right here, will be pointing at the next node instead of this one?
Well, you have to reset current every time. So it's actually current and updated. And then, yeah, you won't have this long chain. You can just do current.data.
And I want to move to the next node. So if current is pointing at the first node,
what
line of code could I write so that it's now pointing at the second node?
Can you just do current.next?
Right. This is the odd little looking thing that you'll see that is the basis of a lot of the code that you're going to write. That's the marching code, right? That marches forward one node. And again, as always, cover up the left side if it's confusing and say, hey, what's current.next? Current.next says I'm ready to point to the next thing, right? I'm going to follow the next pointer. That's this thing. So instead of current pointing to this node, we want current to point to the following node, which is referenced by the next pointer. So this is actually the reference to the next node, and then we're restoring that in current. So after we execute this statement, current has moved over to the next node. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the basis of a lot of what we're going to do here in navigating is we're going to start at the front by creating a reference called current, and we're going to point that at the front because that's our first node, right? Current is going to point at the same thing that front points at, which is that first node. How do we make it advanced? We're going to say current equals current.next. And then how are we going to march such that we make sure we don't go off the end? What's the loop got to look like that's going to help us make sure that we don't go off the end? While what?
While next is not null.
Yeah, it's going to be something like while current dot next is not equal to null, or maybe even while current is not equal to null. It depends, right? It depends. Sometimes it's okay for current to march and actually get to the null thing, so that's okay, right? As long as it doesn't try to use it, right? So we might write a loop that looks something like this. Keep marching as long as current is not null, keep moving along, and eventually we'll get to the end of the list. Current will be null at the end, and then we're done, right? Then we're finished. Okay, make sense? So that's kind of the basis of our traversal code. And we'll talk more about the details here in a minute. Okay, So now let's talk about operations, and let's write one of these things, and then let's go write the code for it. Let's actually start writing some linked list code to bring it to life ourselves. We don't need to